Delegates, please take your seats. We will start in 1 minute.
أن تحتلوا أماكنكم فسنبدأ بعدا 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 فسنبدأ بعدن 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 فسنبدأ بعدن.
Everyone.
صباح الخير للجميع.
I hope you all are ready to begin with today's work,
على أهبة
and
واستعداد
hope
للبدء
you
في
all managed to
عمل
get some
اليوم.
rest.
أعمل بأنكم نلتم قسطكم من الراحة.
We did have good discussions yesterday, but
على
we
ضوء
are also
المناقشات
behind the
البارحة
schedule.
علما بأننا قد تأخرنا في
And today, before we move on with the
الزمني
consideration of the 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 consideration of the
كنت قبلك يتوليك الاتصال
So one of the cultures
so much, Ms. Co-Chair. Yesterday evening we had the contact group for around an hour. Since delegations didn't have time to ask questions to the TIP and the SAP during plenary, in this first meeting, delegations did general questions to both bodies, and we agreed to continue and then move on to the CRP in the next session. We ask you, co-chairs, if it's possible that we meet during lunchtime, since we didn't convene the meeting in the morning. Thank you.
as discussed 2:45 p.m. at conference room 3, if that is fine. Yes. Thank you. And as you may recall, we suspended the agenda item 5 after the presentation from the steering committee on the outcomes of the workshop, and there was also a presentation from the Secretariat highlighting its responses to the requests set out in paragraph B of. So before opening the floor, we also have the presenters present. So therefore now I would like to open the floor and substantive discussion. Who wants to take the floor? EU?
It is EU. Good morning, colleagues. It is, not by accident that I take the floor first, since we somehow are responsible for the whole move, and we would like to thank the presenters yesterday, the members of the steering committee of our project, for the excellent presentations, and which will certainly pave the way forward. We would really like, as EU, thank our partners in engaging in this project, in particular the scientific members of the steering committee, and Paul mentioned yesterday in his presentation other contributions, like from the Michigan Institute of Technology, but foremost it is engagement of the scientific members of the steering committee who contributed very much to the success and to the outcome of the project. But in this context, it's also important to mention the partners in a country where we have established one measurement point for the monitoring, and that is also due to the engagement of Professor Abdus Salam from the University of Dakar, who made it possible to carry out measurements and to test methodologies on how to approach the establishment of new monitoring capacities. Of course, University of Bristol is to be mentioned as well, because they carried out analysis of the flask samples, and they didn't charge anything for that. And that small project due to the great in-kind contributions from others. To ensure or to increase monitoring capacities is for us a very important element for ensuring the success of the Montreal Protocol, and we are convinced that by addressing those gaps in the monitoring, which Paul in his presentation showed very clearly, there are many. So for us it's a very important issue to move ahead to close those. Also, because we have a combined COP and MOP, which allows to take decisions to pave the way for a long-term sustainable enhancement of monitoring capacities. In this context, we are very pleased to read the recommendation of the ozone research managers on this point, confirming that also for the scientific community, the developing of monitoring capacities is of great importance, and also showing some possible ways to make also in terms of financing such moves possible. They mentioned the General Trust Fund for the financing of activities on research and systematic observations, which could indeed be a good way to do the next steps and the first steps before we can agree on a long-term financial arrangement for ensuring continued enhanced monitoring. In this sense, we would like to engage with all parties preferably in a group, either a contact group or informal group, to discuss and to define the possible venue or the possible options for financing future activities. In this respect, both MLF and the Ozone Secretariat did quite thorough groundwork by listing the different options which are on the table. In this respect, we would also, we were wondering how the two opinions, papers by the secretariats are fitting together. For us, there are not all options mentioned in the Ozone Secretariat in relation to the involvement of the multilateral fund fully reflected in the paper in the annex presented by the multilateral fund. So perhaps there we could get some clarifications in the course of this week to have a better view on the options at hand. But that would indeed be work to be done in a group where, of course, the presence of the steering committee members and representatives of the secretariat would be most welcome to explain a bit the interlinkages between the options prepared. But we should indeed try to leave this meeting with a clear idea which avenue or which options we would prefer in the long term. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Is there any other part? 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 I see Brazil waving, but I do also have United States. Okay, United States, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair. Good morning, colleagues. And just return, I see Brazil on the screen, so do I have the floor, or does Brazil have the floor? Giselle have the floor? Giselle have the floor? Giselle have the floor? Giselle have the floor?
We saw Brazil coming in later. I think even yesterday there were some technical issues, so we were hoping that it's resolved today, but now we have United States first. You can have the floor.
Okay, very esteemed colleagues from Brazil as well for their patience. Just to say, very much appreciate the presentation that was made yesterday. It's a little bit tricky, just to be honest, that we had the presentation yesterday and now we open the discussion today. We have some specific questions that we will bring up. But I just want to say, I think for us that, this presentation is helpful. I think we sort of consider this issue in like a very broad context of all the information that we've received and the work that is done by the SAP, by the ORM, and also with respect to this specific project and some of the updates that we've received about Bull Island. So maybe let me, I see you've, Chair, you've said do questions and statements at the same time. So I'll start with a couple of questions and then move into some of our specific comments. The first sort of area of questioning is if we could ask for a bit of a description, like it went up briefly, I think, on one of the slides, but like a little bit of an understanding of the geographic scope and costs of the existing networks that are already out there that we rely on. There's the A-Gauge network, the NOAA network. If we could just ask for sort of a reminder of how many stations that is, you know, kind of ballpark what the rough costs of that is to keep those going, and maybe just to refresh our memory on sort of how long those networks have been in operation and providing data and information, which is obviously not just for this forum, but which is used by this forum, as well as if there's any sort of off-the-cuff information on the cost of that. So that's maybe just a first general question. The second one, maybe coming more specifically into what was presented yesterday. So our understanding is that there were somewhere around, I think it was about 15 of these locations where they did the Aussie, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, assessment of sort of looking at meteorological data to do like sort of a preliminary assessment of the suitability of these, say, 15-ish locations. It'd be useful to hear a little more about that. So, like, I guess, did any of these other locations show particular potential to be useful monitoring sites? How many of them? And then what would be the next steps to go beyond that? Based on the presentation, it sounded like maybe it's Flask. Like if you decided some of those sites had potential, what's the next thing you need to do? Is it actual Flask sampling on the sites? If so, what does that involve to assess it? Like how long do you have to do? Like does it take you a month or 6 months or a year of Flask sampling to sort of get some idea as to whether a site is actually suitable? So that's probably where I would park the questions part of our intervention. Maybe just to move into our statement aspects. Just to say from our perspective, we've said this before, but we think this is really quite an important issue, that we find a way to ensure that we have the atmospheric monitoring that we need to understand with respect to the substances that are controlled under the protocol, what is happening in the atmosphere. So continuing to stay informed about that, and I think getting sort of a more detailed and geographically precise understanding of what emissions look like and how that's affecting the atmosphere is something that we're quite supportive of. I would say the documents for this meeting, I think, are a pretty big step forward, both from a science basis as well as sort of a funding basis, that I think they really inform the parties to an extent that we need to take a step forward this year, and I think we really have the information we need to do that. And I think for this delegation, we didn't necessarily feel like that last year, so I think it's actually quite helpful that we are much better informed as we move into this discussion. I think for us, we generally think of this probably, I would say, in sort of I'm going to call it kind of a staged approach. I think the first stage to us is sort of the identification and assessment of suitable monitoring locations. And I think based on the questions I asked, like some of that has already happened, but I don't think that job has been finished. So I think there's some further work that needs to be done there, sort of in what I would say is sort of the stage one of identification and assessment. What I would say is that from our perspective, I think we do need to have a discussion as parties as to what the best way is to go about doing that. I think we need to do it in a format that is inclusive of, let's say, the Vienna Convention, Montreal Protocol, these bodies. And so we are thinking about, and it's in the Secretariat's paper, about, I think we should really explore whether we could use the Vienna Convention General Trust Fund for observations to take on this task of identification and assessment of locations. Now, to do that, I think that's easier said than done, but I think from our perspective, there's a couple of things we would need to do. We need to make sure we would give them, their existing mandate is much more focused on ozone measurements, so I think we would have to think about changing that mandate a little bit. I think we are open with respect to the transfer of some level of resources that I think we as parties need to discuss from the trust funds for the Secretariat of the Vienna Convention and the Montreal Protocol. So that to us is sort of the first piece of this picture, is how do we come to grips as parties and with our institutions to identify and assess these locations. So I think there's already been some preliminary work on 15 locations, but listen, there could be other locations as well. We wouldn't necessarily limit it to that, but we'd also say we should build upon some of the work that's already been done. Now, that leads me sort of to the second aspect, or what, we could call a stage two, which is once you've sort of done the work to identify and assess the locations, from our perspective, we need to find a way then to support additional monitoring at certain locations. And I think to us, there's a number of sort of parameters to this. I think there are parts of the globe that are more suitable for a number of reasons. So I think in the presentation yesterday, there were several parameters that were mentioned. One, this is hard to do, so you need a good partner institution to do it. You need to make sure that you can manage the data dissemination and data availability issues. You need to find sites where you can get good measurements out of them. You need to find sites that actually are measuring parts of the world where we have a monitoring gap, or that we would view as a priority for obtaining additional monitoring information. And so I think to us, I think that's the kind of discussion we would welcome having at this meeting. I think to us, the Secretariat paper actually lays out a number of possibilities, and the presentation yesterday indicated a few of these. I'll be honest, in theory, the GEF, the GCF, the Bezos Earth Fund, the MLF, in theory, these can all do it. I just have to say, I think as a practical matter, we need an institution that's going to be able to move forward in the next few years to start working on this. I'm just rather skeptical that we're going to convince some of these other institutions to sort of take on a monitoring task for the Montreal Protocol and the Vienna Convention. I think that's a really, really tough sell. We have no institutional authority over any of those bodies. We're going to have to develop MOUs or means of communicating or operating or engaging with them. I just see a lot of institutional hurdles and difficulties around that. So I think, based on substantial reflection on that, I think our own preference would be to explore ideas for how we would go about doing that through our own multilateral fund. To us, that would have to be done in a very targeted way, a limited way. I think the core function of the multilateral fund remains to support Article 5 countries in facilitating compliance with control obligations. Now, I think this is related to that, right? It's related to compliance, but it's not a direct financial support for compliance. So I think to us, it probably would fit in the context of something like a funding window of some sort. So I think that's our general idea, sort of from a policy perspective. We think we should be working this year towards a decision that would move forward our efforts on monitoring, both with respect to what I described as stage 1, so further actions and support for those, which means financial support for identifying and assessing monitoring locations, but also beginning to move things forward with respect to how we would ultimately finance the establishment of monitoring, whether that is flask samplings or whether it's actually, a monitoring station with a Medusa. So certainly it's a complicated issue, and we look forward. We'd support establishment of a contact group at this meeting to really start digging into these issues. Thank you.
Now I'd like to give the floor to Brazil, but I do not see you on the list, but it was confirmed that you are requesting for the floor.
Good morning, dear colleagues. We'd like to thank the Secretariat and the Steering Committee for the information presented yesterday. It is essential that we continue to guide our work by science, and for that to happen, investments in research are necessary. We have a few questions to make sure that we have the most accurate information. The first one relates to the number of stations. Do you have an estimate of how many stations would be needed to significantly improve data accuracy? From what I remember, you presented a number of stations, maybe 4, but are those sufficient, or once we build them, we will need to take another step and put all new stations? Secondly, has there been any attempt to improve controlling system in the past? If so, what was the approach taken by the parties? Maybe history can enlighten us in this matter. Thirdly, although it was interesting to hear about other sources of funding, such as philanthropy, we are concerned about the sustainability of these funds. You mentioned, for instance, fixed costs. Could you provide more information on how much are we talking about? Because these values may be eventually absorbed by funds that we already have in place. Yes. And lastly, still on funding, we noticed that low estimates and higher ones are still extremely far apart from each other. The figures vary from 50,000 to more than 1 million. It is still quite difficult to have a more realistic idea on that. In that sense, what next steps could you take to provide more accurate estimates on these values? We think one possibility is to further explore synergies with other organizations and see where we could benefit from existing stations. Another one is to take into existing stations that are no longer working. For instance, we have information that this could be the case for at least one station in Brazil. So maybe that could be a way forward to reduce costs. Those are just general reflections. Sorry for taking so long. Thank you.
The steering committee members to respond to the questions from the US and from Brazil. Thank you.
For these interventions and questions. First of all, I want to thank the EU for acknowledging Professor Gonnison from the University of Bristol and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology for the work they've contributed, but also Professor Salam from Bangladesh and the University of Dhaka, who has done a huge amount of work at Bola Island to enable this pilot project. So thank you for bringing that up. It was mentioned on one of the slides, but they've really done a huge amount of work, and they deserve our thanks. A couple of questions that were asked. The question from the U.S. on a bit of description of the geographical scope and costs and number of stations. Just really quickly, I will remark that Ken Jux, who is one of the SAP co-chairs, funds the U.S. portion of the A-gauge network that I showed, which is about 1/3 of the network, and he tells me that it's about $2.8 million in operational costs per year for that third. So you can triple that for the total amount, about $9 million in operational costs for A-gauge. Now that funds scientists and research. So a lot of the work that you see from A-gauge, the papers that are published that you all react to, that is funded with that $9 million. Steve Monska is here. Steve does the NOAA network work, and he analyzes flasks. I showed a few of Steve's pictures from Steve's laboratory, and in fact I showed you a case of flasks from Steve's lab. He probably, I don't have a number from Steve, but I think he can get us something, and I would guess that it's probably comparable. Now that leverages off the fact that Steve's salary is paid directly by NOAA in any case, so there would be in-kind savings there. That would be true of other labs that would analyze flasks. But that's just a roundabout cost estimate. The number of stations that we would need, and I'm going to jump a little bit to the question from Brazil. First of all, there is no monitoring in South America of ODSs, HFCs, HCFCs at present. And so a station in Brazil would actually be a scientific gold mine, if you ask me. You would see new things coming out of South America, things we don't see around the rest of the world. So I think something either in Brazil or the Andes would be actually really scientifically, I'm getting a little bit enthusiastic here as a scientist, but pardon me for that. But we would actually be able to monitor South America as a region. But I think there would be interesting findings from any station that we located in South America. The next thing to do, I think that from the steering committee, Cornelius, myself, Sophia, we would do additional OSCEs. We would certainly invest in flask sampling from a number of locations, additional locations, if we had more money to do this, to begin to explore their suitability as observation stations. If I showed you the list of 15 stations that we've looked at, you will see that they're mainly located in key regions, and some are very good, and some of the OSCEs showed that these stations would be very good if implemented, and others of the OSCEs show less return on investment. They would be good for global monitoring, but for regional monitoring, they probably wouldn't be particularly good. The first question for Brazil, the number of stations to significantly improve. I think if we had 10 new stations scientifically, I think the scientists would be ecstatic, particularly in the regions that I showed that are missing. If we had good stations there, we really could take the regional observations and sum them up and show the total global, that would match up with the total global emissions estimates. And so 10 would be outstanding, but even 3 to 5 would be a significant improvement if in the right regions. As far as funding, I will defer to Sophia on funding and steps for accuracies.
and thank you very much for your questions. Regarding, I think the distinguished delegate from Brazil asked a question about whether we had some experience from the past to show us how we dealt with these issues. Well, the experience we have is what we are doing now under the Vienna Convention Trust Fund on Research and Systematic Observations. Basically, in 2002, there was a decision under the Vienna Convention, Decision 6/2, which established the Vienna Convention Trust Fund for the monitoring of ozone, UV, and ozone profiles. However, that decision said that consideration to other issues could be given if the ORM, the ozone research managers, and the SAP and the EAP think that there are some other issues that have to be addressed. TEEP was left out, but I guess, I don't know why. Then the decision asked also us to work with the World Meteorological Organization because they have the expertise to implement a lot of projects. And then since then, we've been having a lot of projects which have been implemented around the world, but these projects are only for monitoring of ozone and UV and ozone profiles. Since 2014-15, we had an advisory committee. There was again a decision by the meeting of the parties establishing an advisory committee that actually develops a strategy on how to move and also evaluates the project proposals, because before this evaluation was done by the Ozone Secretariat in cooperation with WMO, but now we have actually an advisory committee of experts. So that was the process. Now so there was a decision basically under the Vienna Convention that paved the way for this. Now, of course, the issue is a bit more complicated. We have now controlled substances, so any decision you may need to take will perhaps require decisions both from the MOP and the COP, depending how you want to deal with this. So it's up to you. Regarding the big range of funds, yes, we agree. It's a huge range, and all these, as I said yesterday, they were very rough estimates. They're based on very rough assumptions. The lower costs are the ones which assume that we have existing infrastructure which basically can be given almost free. Think about the Ball Island project, for example. Then we didn't have to, all the research which was done at the laboratory in the University of Bristol was heavily subsidized, so a lot of flasks were donated by them, and a lot of the work which was done locally in Bangladesh was also very cheaply made. But of course, this is an ideal situation. That's why we have, if you do flask sampling on a weekly basis, that's also the frequency which is important. On a weekly basis, you can reduce the costs of the operating, let's say, and capital cost to even 50,000. But this is a very idealistic scenario. So in the case that the higher estimates assume that you have to build the infrastructure. You have to build roads, you have to build the towers that will have to be doing all these measurements and so on. So yes, we realize that the cost, so I think the best thing is if you have a specific location and this location has been confirmed by OCEs that actually it's a good location because the air masses will intercept this station for most of the time of the year, then you have to look at the specifics. You have to look is there any other, if you do mapping, you may find out that there is a station actually under another network which operates there, and perhaps you could piggyback on that. So then you try to see how you can reduce costs. You have to play with this. But yes, at this stage we were not able to, we were able only to provide a very wide range, but yes, we appreciate that this is very wide, and then it will depend on the case that you will have to look at, and then you have to see what kind of other parameters you will need to have in place and how you can finance them from other sources, if it's possible. I don't know if, yeah?
Just a couple of comments about Bola Island. Bola Island already had a building, the little station there had a building. It also had a 10-meter tower. So it made it, we definitely leveraged the costs. We didn't have to build the tower. We didn't have to build the little house for it. So we did leverage costs on that. And as Sophia remarked, we also had the University of Bristol already had the analytic facilities to analyze those flasks. So we really did, do something on the cheap. I won't say we didn't do it cheaply, but we did something because we had infrastructure in place. Thanks. Are we done?
Yes, I hope that this response.
Thank you. On my list, I have Kuwait, Nigeria, Japan, Lebanon, China, India, Canada, Guinea, Kenya, Norway, Indonesia. If any other party would like to take the floor, please do so, and Australia. And this is the time to take the floor. We will be closing the list soon. So first, I would like to give the floor to Kuwait.
Thank the steering committee and the excellent presentation yesterday, opening our mind about a lot of issues that it's need been to know. And I just want to also appreciate the scientists, as is mentioned by Paul Newman, that without the scientists, good or bad of them, we will not be here discussing this, and we should not have the fund at that time. So without Mr. Migley finding fluorinated gases, we will not be having the whole, and without the scientists finding the whole, we will not be here. So let's appreciate scientists giving us a job and a hard task to do. So saying that, I think previous distinguished delegates mentioned a lot of my question, but there is one element, as you mentioned, now in applying for the question, that you are thinking of 10 stations and the minimum of 3 stations places to be used as a monitoring. I just want to understand how you will prioritize these locations. If you have 3, how you will prioritize which 3 location will be the best, or 10. The second thing, if you have an options to have like 5 or 6 within a specific amount of money, how you will prioritize that? This is only flex sampling, or it will be optimized? So there is a lot of uncertainty for us how you will prioritize this thing. The most important things for us now is the role of the country which this monitoring station will be there. What is their jurisdictions, and what is our influence on these stations and data? We have to understand, and also if these countries have an ability to co-finance something because they are interested to have this one. So also we have to engage with these countries. If the priority for the country which willing to be co-finance, it's having a priority rather than other countries. So I think this also question need to be answered from several issues. And also on the calculation basis, as you are mentioning, I think usually we are calculating on the commercial basis, that this is how we do it. But we see it when we do it under United Nations regime, the prices will jump in a way that it's not logic sometimes. So because they know there is a fund, and so the accuracy will be there. The last thing, as the distinguished delegate from USA mentioning, I will totally support John on his idea. It's usually I don't support John totally every time, but this time I will totally support him, that we think that the fund for this monitoring station it should be under MLF or under our regime, because this data is really totally involving our job, and all the result of this data will affect the compliance of countries and also the we say the reliability of this data, because we don't want third party to engage with this data and starting. And also publishing this data and affecting countries about this data is also something that we have to be very sensitive. And if we say that we want it to be under Lausanne Secretariat and Vienna Convention and MLF within this frame, we also want to make sure the sustainability of these stations and the fund for this station to run every time. So also that will indicate how the fund and the term of reference for this fund add the sustainability for this role. Secondly, if we go to the MLF and our regime scenario, I think you also to have to indicate the role of the implementing agencies, because we only work under implementing agencies, how they're purchasing and how this, and this is something also we need to look at and to understand firmly about this one. I will stop here and I will give the chance for others to answer. Thank you very much again. 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 Thank you very much again.
Yeah.
And good morning, everybody. I wish to commend the Secretariat and the Steering Committee for their comprehensive, information. I will be glad to have further clarification on the regions with gaps that are being considered in the mapping process for setting up stations to monitor controlled substances with particular reference to Africa. Thank you.
Japan.
We'd like to express our sincere thanks to the Steering Committee and Secretariat for their excellent presentation on the outcome of the workshop, as well as the information on the cost estimate and possible option for sustainable funding, which are all very informative and useful. And given the recent issues of unexpected CFC-11 emissions and concerns over HFC-23 emissions, Japan also shares the importance of enhancing global and regional atmospheric monitoring. We are open to any option for further discussion, but we also keen to know and wish to discuss more about how we can achieve this within limited financial resources and how it can be realized in cost-effective and efficient manner. In this regard, we concur with the ideas and points articulated in the presentation by the Steering Committee that cost-sharing and existing facility use and in-kind assistance can greatly reduce costs. We also share the view on the need to work more with other observation programs, such as those of WMO and CTBTO, especially where the gaps exist. We believe that we should explore such collaboration and synergies with other international programs and networks and utilizing existing infrastructure. We look forward to further discussion at the contact group. Thank you.
The Steering Committee members to respond. And before they finish answering the questions, please do indicate if you would like to take the floor, and after that we will close the list. Thank you. 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 Thank you.
The comments and questions. Let me address first the question from the distinguished delegate from Kuwait on how to prioritize. Clearly, we would take a look at where we think there are emissions that could help to close the the gaps that we see. And so that would be, I think, the fundamental priority is how do we close this global gaps. The second priority is one of can we actually, there are a lot of places that you'd like to locate a station, but some are just either not workable, that is, it's too expensive to build a station there, or, you have just a myriad of problems building these stations. So we'd have to look at, is a station actually, can it actually be put in a particular spot? I think that's the second thing we would take a look at. Obviously, if it's a really high priority spot and we had available funding, we would do that. But if we could do 3 stations that are moderately successful, we'd have to take a close look at that also. I think this would be done within probably a steering committee of some sort, or within a scientific committee that would have to make these judgments about where emissions are and which stations would give us the greatest scientific yield, or the greatest scientific yield for this body to understand emissions. In terms of the interventions from Nigeria, the delegates from Nigeria and Japan, I think those were statements, and so I think that answers the questions we got. Thank you.
Our delegation take the floor. I would like to begin by extending our sincere gratitude to the Ozone Secretariat and the Government of Canada for organizing this meeting. Your efforts are always deeply appreciated in coordinating and facilitating our discussions. We appreciate the committee's comprehensive report and the efforts made to provide detailed cost estimates and potential locations of new atmospheric monitoring stations. The enhanced monitoring stations of substances controlled by the Montreal Protocol are vital for protecting the ozone layer. In light of this information presented, we would like to address several key points, some of which were already addressed by our colleagues, but and also to facilitate a more thorough understanding. We do recognize the importance of identifying sustainable funding options for establishing new regional monitoring capacities, and as the distinguished delegates from USA and Kuwait supported funding options from MLF, it's also important if we look into other options and to consider the following. What are the advantages and disadvantages of various funding options considered? And in the case of looking into other options, how does the Secretariat propose to engage potential donors and stakeholders in securing the necessary funds, and how will they be streamlined to ensure efficiency? On another point, we noticed that the development of monitoring expansion strategy is essential for successful implementation of the proposed enhancement. The report also mentioned the significant cost associated with establishing both high-frequency and low-frequency monitoring stations, and considering the financial implications. To this end, a more clear understanding would kindly be requested on how will the committee ensure that the strategy remains flexible and adaptable to evolving scientific, technical, and financial circumstances. Speaking of mitigating potential financial risks associated with the currency fluctuations, inflation, and other economic factors that might impact the costs. The report also mentions on the potential of collaboration with existing networks such as the Global Atmospheric Watch and the Global Environmental Monitoring System. In this context, we would like to ask about the mechanism that will be put in place to facilitate data sharing and collaboration between different international programs, and how will the Secretariat be able to coordinate with these networks to avoid duplication of efforts and ensure cohesive approach to monitoring. We commend the steering committee for its diligent work and its important matter, and we look forward to continued collaboration, and addressing these questions will be crucial for ensuring the success and sustainability of your efforts. Thank you. Read out the list once again, and then we will close with this list. First, China, India, Canada, Guinea, Kenya, Norway, Indonesia, Australia, Cameroon, and Russian Federation. With this, I also close the list and would like to give the floor to China.
In recent years, the parties has had extensive discussion and exploration on enhancing global atmospheric monitoring of controlled substances. We are very glad to see the progress in this regard. We thank Ozone Secretariat, SAP, the Steering Committee of EU, ORM, and WMO for their efforts and contribution. The atmospheric sites, monitoring sites, and the information provided on cost estimating provide a good basis for our discussion. There are some areas that are not covered by this monitoring. To complete this network will be a complex and long-term system engineering that requires high technology and major capital cost. Obviously, the parties face difficulties and challenges. For A5 countries, the development of these sites requires not only adequate funding, but also technology, data quality control, and sampling methodology. We hope that in the discussion we can fully give consideration to the Article 5 countries in their expertise and capacity building and provide support in funding technology and capacity building. Also considering this is a complex system engineering, and we have limited experience, we suggest to adopt a staged approach. We are willing to have further exchanges in these the floor to India, and after that I will give back to steering committee members to respond. Thank you. 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 Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Good morning, everybody. We would like to thank the Ozone Secretariat for the information and the steering committee for the presentation. While the cost estimates for setting up of and operationalization monitoring stations have been presented in quite detail, there needs to be more discussion on the implementation of fund options, including the modalities. Just we want to understand whether any other method is available other than flask method, such as light absorbing method for atmospheric monitoring of substance controlled by Montreal Protocol. Further discussion is also needed on the modalities of identification of countries and locations, including obtaining commitment from the identified countries. While some of the external funding options have been proposed, we feel that the funding should be under the framework of the Montreal Protocol and the multilateral fund. There is also a need for further discussion on the processes of operationalization the funding. We therefore propose further discussion on these issues in a group. Thank you, Madam Co-Chair.
In committee to respond to these questions.
Thank you very much for your questions. Perhaps I can respond to the question by the distinguished delegate from Lebanon regarding how the Secretariat is planning to engage with other organizations in order to streamline processes. Now we have, we just did only an initial study trying to find out what other organizations we can approach, and as you can see in the note, in the addendum to the note by the Secretariat, we, of course, the long-standing partner we've had, WMO, is a very important institution. And then we have Jeff, we have CTBTO, and the Green Climate Fund we didn't manage to explore very much, but then we can do that. But the idea is that if we can have a mapping from these institutions about the monitoring stations that they have in place, then we could probably see that some of these stations fulfill certain criteria for monitoring controlled substances. Or maybe in some cases, especially in the case of Jeff, which has a project for monitoring the Stockholm, Stockholm gases, the POPs and mercury under Stockholm and Minamata conventions, they are setting up laboratories. So perhaps in that case, perhaps we can use the same laboratories to analyze this, not necessarily the stations. So these are the things that we have to investigate. I think having a mapping of all possible locations of stations under the different networks, WMO for example, and other stations are also the ones under the measuring ambient air quality under the long-range transboundary air pollution perhaps. Having an idea, then we can move on from that. So this was only an initial stage. Yeah, that's all I have to do. We need to collect more information to understand how we can move further on that. Yeah, thank you very much. I think Paul will take the rest of the questions.
Thank you. Let me address, first of all, the questions from the distinguished delegate from Lebanon. One of the questions was how to ensure flexibility in how we implement things and how we operate things. Clearly, if we do have the VCTF steering committee, scientific steering committee, would be handling sort of prioritization and how money is moved around. They would know what are the scientific priorities and what are the priorities coming out of you parties in terms of various gases that need measurements. The scientists do pay very close attention to new production, new species that are being developed, and so that would get included within a lot of these species that we'd be interested in. Also, how we take the measurements, we're actually doing analysis on flask, the frequency that you make flask measurements. Do you make them once per day, twice per day, once per week, once per month? And can we match up with the higher frequency measurements? So can we do flask measurements at a lower cost, but more infrequently? So there's, I think, a fair amount of flexibility within how we develop new stations. As far as data sharing, it is now almost impossible to publish a scientific paper if the data is not public. You have to make the data public. Okay, that is now a requirement in the most prominent scientific journals. You have to have public data. I think this is a very wise policy that they've developed because that allows other scientists to take a close look at that data. I will remark that the NOAA data and the A-gauge data are publicly available. You could all just get on your laptops there and take a look at what's happening with the A-gauge data, day-to-day, well, I guess it's a month-to-month basis. And look what they're doing. That's not the estimate of emissions, but you can look at what the concentrations are from month to month at the A-gauge site. The coordination of efforts is actually done quite well, I think, between the A-gauge network and the NOAA network. They have twice per year, the A-gauge group has twice per year meetings in which scientists from around the world come together. So there is great coordination in calibration and validation, in understanding what the two networks are showing, and I think that's reflected in a lot of the emissions that were shown. For Steve Ponska showed dichloromethane yesterday, and also carbon tetrachloride. He showed both networks data. So those data are freely available, and they are pretty closely coordinated. I wanted to address the distinguished delegate from China and their intervention. China has developed one of these high-frequency GCMSs, instruments that measures in the parts per trillion level, and there are a number of them being installed around China. The question from the distinguished delegate of India, thank you for that, are there other measurements that can be used? And I will remark that, in fact, there was a study done from an aircraft using flasks over India and I can't remember the exact date now of the paper, but they showed that, in fact, there were not, for 1 year or one particular season, they showed that there were not substantial CFC-11 emissions coming from India. So you can use flasks on an airplane, so we can go, if we think there's a particular region that might have a problem, we can use a different strategy to get emissions. That would be something that would be up to the Scientific Steering Committee, but we can use flasks to do that. Satellites can also measure CFC. Satellites can measure CFCs, not particularly well. A lot of satellites look straight down, and they get what's called a column measurement, so the total number of CFC or HFC molecules in a particular column below the satellite. That is a relatively crude technique. It's clearly not up to the parts per trillion levels that we need to evaluate emissions, but it is possible to look at regions of hotspots around the globe. There's also another technique where you look at the edge of the Earth's atmosphere. You use a satellite to look through the edge, and you can come up with a profile of these various molecules. The problem with that is it doesn't look down into the troposphere very well. It looks in the stratosphere quite well, but it doesn't look down in the troposphere where most of the emissions are happening. So there are other techniques, and there are other methodologies that we can use to evaluate emissions, but kind of in a one-off way with aircraft. So I hope that provides a reasonable answer for your question. If not, please contact me, and we can have a bilateral on that. So thank you, and I think I captured all.
Canada?
First of all, let me say that we are really appreciative of the work undertaken by the Secretariat, the Scientific Assessment Panel, the Ozone Research Managers, the TIAP, and also the Multilateral Fund Secretariat in responding to the decision that we took last year on this issue. That's been very helpful. And it is very useful that this was really considered by the ORM this year, and that they made some recommendation and they reviewed the results of the cost workshop that was organized. So we really feel that we're being well guided by the scientists on this issue, and that's very important, and that's going to need to continue throughout this process. We've been discussing this issue now for quite a number of years, I think perhaps at least 5 years, but we really feel that at this stage, this is coming together in a very exciting way, that we may be at the stage where we could actually take some decisions that bring us forward. We note that the costs that are provided are broad estimates, as has been mentioned by others, and they could vary significantly depending on the particular site selected. Certain costs, such as personnel costs, are not included. But I think, if we look at the information in the cost workshop, I think we were able to understand what are the different components that could lead to variations in the cost. And ultimately, what we want is sort of a ballpark figure to know, what we're talking about, right? So, and then having this ballpark figure helps us to figure out what would be potential funding instruments that we could look at. Enhancing global and regional atmospheric monitoring is a long-term project, of course. It's going to take many years to implement. But in our view, we have sufficient information now, perhaps to adopt decisions this year to initiate implementation of some work in this area. So based on the information, the analysis, the potential options that have been prepared by the Secretariat, Canada would support also moving forward with a step-by-step approach at this point, and we would be ready to at least consider this year a transfer of a portion of the cash balances from either the Vienna Convention Trust Fund or the Montreal Protocol Trust Fund, or perhaps a portion of each towards the General Trust Fund for financing activities on research and systematic observations relevant to the Vienna Convention, even though we think that that name is too long, so we need to adjust that. So let's call it the GTF, I think. That's the abbreviation we're using, if I'm not mistaken. So this would be for initial activities to support one, maybe two monitoring stations, probably flask sampling at this stage, once suitable sites, of course, have been identified. Important to note that a decision on transfer of funds from the Vienna Convention Trust Fund, that obviously would need to be taken by the COP of the Vienna Convention, which, as we know, is also meeting this year. So the GTF, in our view, just to provide a rationale of why we think it would be a suitable instrument. It has experience already in supporting projects in Article 5 countries and countries' economies in transition, where the majority of the gaps really have been identified. So we've seen before geographically where the gaps are located, and they're mostly in developing country regions. And the GTF has experience in undertaking atmospheric projects, albeit related to the monitoring of ozone and the calibration of instruments, not controlled substances. But it does have a steering or advisory committee that includes scientists, which we understand have scientific and technical expertise related to both kinds of atmospheric monitoring. There may be a need perhaps for additional expertise at this stage. We don't know, and we'll rely again on the guidance of the scientists for that. It has well-established policies and procedures, and it has a formal partnership with the World Meteorological Organization, the WMO, which again is another important partners that we think would be good to have on this issue. Now, over the more medium term, let's say, over 5 years and beyond, in order to sustain this, we also would support that parties at least explore the multilateral fund, providing financing for the establishment of more flash sampling and high-frequency stations in Article 5 countries. I would say at this stage we may not be as definitive as we've heard some other delegations at this meeting, but we do think that it is an option that is worth pursuing. We don't see it as being directly related to compliance really at this stage, but we're thinking about this issue. But I think as the U.S. has mentioned, we also need to be pragmatic about this issue, and the multilateral fund has a lot of advantages. I think for us, it's got predictable, sustainable financing. It's an effective, well-proven institutions for funding projects in Article 5 countries. And it's also under the responsibility of the parties to the Montreal Protocol. It would be good to at least initially keep this process within the Montreal Protocol family. We think that would make it perhaps more efficient, at least in the short term. Now, I would say that should parties wish to enable MLF support for atmospheric monitoring activities in the future, we do feel that the MOP would need to take a decision in this area, because these activities are very different than the ones being supported by the MLF. And we would need to look at a range of issues related to the processes that would need to put in place within the multilateral fund to develop, implement, report projects, as well as a potential collaboration with the GTF if we want the GTF to continue to be involved in this issue. So there's many issues that would need to be looked at, whether we look at them at the level of the meeting of the parties, or at some point we may want to ask the EXCOM perhaps to report to us on some of these more administrative, and organizational issues. If there is interest in moving forward in terms of those short-term and long-term approaches, then I think this OEWG needs to have robust discussions on what we would need in terms of decisions and procedures to make this happen. So at this point, I don't have more questions for the Secretariat or the SAP at this point, but we do have a number of more organizational questions for us as parties that we think we would need to address, and probably a contact group would be a good venue to that. So are we looking in the short term, for one station? Over the medium term, we need to think about how many we need, and try to also, while focusing on the short term, try to have an idea of, what is a direction that we want to go to over the longer term. Because I think over the longer term, what we would like is for these stations to be integrated within the existing atmospheric networks, to share the data, and to be able to sustain themselves. So they need to also be integrated within national frameworks and institutions, right? Because the funding, the multilateral fund may not be there forever, but we're going to want this monitoring to continue a long time before after even some of us are gone, right? There are also some procedural issues that will need to be addressed. For instance, both the Vienna Convention Trust Fund and the GTF are under the responsibility or the authority of the COP of the Vienna Convention, which meets only 3 years. So we would need to figure out, from an administrative point of view, how do we structure, our decisions between the Montreal Protocol and the Vienna Convention, so that we're able to move forward, but also get the reporting that we would need with respect to the work that would be undertaken. Another question we have is regarding the mandate and the mode of operation of the GTF. Should we be looking at perhaps reviewing the mandate and the terms of reference that were adopted at the 7th conference of the parties? We're not saying necessarily that we should, but I think that is something that would probably be useful for us to look at. As well, I think, as Secretariat mentioned, there would probably need to be some adjustments in the current operation of the GTF, including with respect to the reporting on the contributions that would be received. Another issue we should be cognizant of is the workload on the Montreal Protocol, the Vienna Convention in general, that would be additional as a result of this work. So I think what's mentioned in some of the documents by the Secretariat is the workload on the Ozone Secretariat. There could also be potentially additional workload on the Multilateral Fund Secretariat, and also on our scientific assessment panel. We should have an idea of what that means, and also what that could mean in terms of additional administrative costs, which are not, I think, fully considered yet in the costs that we have here. So I'll stop here. I just wanted to indicate some sort of few overarching issues and questions that we think should be addressed. And, if we're moving forward with a contact group on this issue, hopefully we can have that discussion and address these and many other questions with other parties. Thank you.
give the floor to Guinea.
Vice-présidente,
Madam Co-Chair,
je profite de cette
I
occasion
would like to take this
pour
opportunity
d'abord
to
remercier sincèrement le secrétariat
express
de
my sincere
l'Ozone par
thanks to the
rapport
Ozone
à
Secretariat
cette organisation
for
et
organizing this meeting.
aussi remercier le
And I also
gouvernement du
thank the
Canada
government of Canada
par rapport à l'accueil chaleureux.
for their warm welcome.
Dans le cadre ici de l'amélioration
In
de la surveillance
matter
atmosphérique
at hand,
des substances
enhancing
contrôlées par
atmospheric
le
monitoring
protocole de
of
Montréal,
controlled
beaucoup
substances
d'efforts ont
under the
été fournis.
Montreal Protocol. A
C'est
lot of
pourquoi
efforts have been
ma
made,
délégation
and this is
par
why
ma
my
voix
delegation
remercie sincèrement
would
le
like
TIEP,
to
le SAP, le
express its
comité
deep thanks to
directeur,
TEEP
ainsi que
and
toutes les parties
SAP,
prenantes
the
pour
steering
les
committee
résultats
and all
obtenus.
stakeholders for the results
L'une de mes
achieved.
préoccupations
One of my
a été abordée
concerns
par
has already
le
been
délégué du
addressed
Brésil.
by the delegate of Brazil.
Madame la vice-présidente,
But Madam
les
Co-Chair,
résultats
the
de recherche
results
ont
of
montré qu'il
research
n'existe ici aucune
show
preuve
that there is
pour le
no
moment à l'effet que
evidence
les
at this
changements
time
naturels sont des
that
facteurs déterminants de la
natural
tendance
changes are a decisive factor in the
à long
trends
terme de
of
diminution
the long
de
term
l'apport énergétique du
reducing
Soleil comme
ozone,
particules chargées telles que
ozone
les
depletion.
protons et les électrons
Charged,
varie surtout selon le cycle d'état solaire.
particles
Et alors, comme rôle principal,
exist
l'ozone
and
absorbe les UV
ozone
et
absorbs
émis par le
UV
Soleil,
light
réchauffant
from the
ainsi
sun
la
and
stratosphère et
warms
aidant
the
à briser
stratosphere
le vortex polaire pendant le
and
printemps. Mais
heightens the
s'il
polar
y a
vortex
moins
in
de
the
zones
spring.
à la fin
But if there are fewer
d'un
zones
hiver donné, la stratosphère
in
demeure
the winter season,
froide et le
then
vortex ici
the
devient
stratosphere
plus fort et
remains
persiste beaucoup
cold
plus
and
longtemps
the vortex
pendant la saison.
persists for a
Un
longer period
vortex
of time.
plus fort
A stronger vortex
au niveau du polaire persiste
at the
très
poles
longtemps alors que les
can
effets
stay for a
observés
long
à la
time,
surface de la
and
Terre
the
peuvent
effects
être ici
observed on the
des
Earth's
précipitations
surface
inhabituelles
might
et
be
des températures
unusual
inhabituelles.
precipitation
Alors,
and
donc, je dirais,
temperatures.
ma question est de
So,
savoir
my
quels sont
question
les
is,
effets
what are the
effectivement de ces
effects
phénomènes naturels
of these natural
sur la
phenomena
qualité
on
et le processus d'échantillonnage des substances
quality
contrôlées
and
par le protocole de
procedure
Montréal.
for
Je vous remercie.
sampling under the Montreal Protocol. Thank you.
The floor to Kenya.
This delegation would also like to thank the steering committee on the presentation of the outcomes. When the presentation was done yesterday, a map showing locations of the monitoring stations was projected. However, it did not show the stations in Africa. It provided a caveat that most of the Africa is largely absent from the map, actually only features one country, and another caveat that not all the stations' footprints are shown. Madam Co-Chair, Kenya has a monitoring station located in Mount Kenya. This delegation is aware that the Vienna Convention trust funds were used to train staff in that station to enhance their capabilities, and we would like to thank the Ozone Secretariat for this. This delegation would therefore like to have information on this monitoring station located in Kenya, and if it's measuring all the controlled substances, and also, Madam Co-Chair, the rationale of why the monitoring stations in the African region are largely absent from the map. Thank you, Madam Co-Chair.
Norway, followed by Indonesia.
I would like to thank the steering committee and the Ozone Secretariat for their presentation yesterday, and also for all the informative documents prepared for this meeting. We took carefully note of the different steps for choosing a location and setting up a monitoring station presented by Paul Newman yesterday, as well as the critical requirements for ensuring sustainable monitoring over time, as well as data reporting and sharing, as this is a keystone. We thank once more the EU for the project that they have conducted. It provides us with useful insights, and we should build on experiences and lessons learned from this project. In a more general view, we would prefer using the existing infrastructure as far as possible in order to minimize environmental footprint of building new infrastructure, also bearing in mind that it is more costly. Therefore, we would be supportive of working with other observation programs, for example, WMO or those related to air quality, in order to identify existing sites and infrastructure that could be appropriate for our purpose here. Regarding financing options, we think it could be good to use some of the cash balances from the Trust Fund for the Vienna Convention and for the Montreal Protocol. We understand that the most appropriate option would be that this money would be managed through the General Trust Fund for financing activities on research and systematic observation relevant to Vienna Convention. Too long. At this point, we would like to emphasize a concern that is important to address in our view. This General Trust Fund has worked on the basis of voluntary contribution, and it has been challenging over many years to ensure that there will be enough money for the purpose of this fund. And we should not undermine the importance of those activities when we now are contemplating the idea of transferring some more funds, some more money to pursue a new type of activities that in our view are also really important to finance and pursue. So perhaps we should think about how these available cash balances could be used, could be beneficial for both supporting the activities already mandated by the General Trust Fund as well as the new activities that we are discussing of financing under this item. So to recap, we would like to make progress in enhancing the global and regional coverage for the atmospheric monitoring of controlled substances. At first, we would be supportive of a step-by-step approach, considering the money available, but also that we carefully need to assess which level of ambition would be appropriate in the long term. And we look forward to continuing discussions, also to figure out on an appropriate long-term strategy and exploring options for long-term financing. And in this context, we will be interested in getting more information about opportunities for collaborating and co-financement with other organizations that are active in emissions monitoring, such as the GEF or GCF and WMO. Thank you, Co-Chair.
This, I will hand over back to the steering committee for this to answer this round of questions. Thank you. Indonesia, you have the floor. 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 You have the floor.
Of the view that having a new observatory stations is urgently needed and will support the discussion forward on this important agenda. However, aligned with other Article 5 countries' views, we believe that improving the human resource capacity is also important to complement the establishment of new observatory stations. Referring to the ORM 12 report, Indonesia proposed new station in monitoring ozone, ODS, UV radiation, and air pollutants, as well as observation station of vertical distribution of ODS and UV radiation. Indonesia's strategic location between Asia and Australia continent, as well as the hub between the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, will provide a more balanced and comprehensive data compared to another region. Indonesia's strategic location will also make a more balanced regional representation worldwide. In this regard, we would like to once again seek the support from the Secretariat, Steering Committee, and through funding support from existing trust fund from the Vienna Convention and Montreal Protocol to establish new observatory stations in Indonesia. Indonesia believes that funding support from the related trust fund, DMLF, will help us to focus on the core purpose of establishing new observatory stations without adding more burden to exercise other experiments beyond its mandated tax. Thank you, Madam Co-Chair.
Steering committee members.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. So there are a couple of questions that I'll try to address. First, from the distinguished delegate of Guinea, and I'll paraphrase the question: how are the effects of natural variations impacting emissions and observations at the surface? And these are actually it's a delicate, quite important question. We know as climate changes, for example, the monsoons will change. The transport of emitted air over stations will also change. So we have to be very cognizant of that. Fortunately, the meteorological data that we have is actually quite good. Compared when I started as an atmospheric scientist, I can't remember if it was around when George Washington was president or not. Meteorological observations were not that good, but now they are actually very high quality and very high resolution. So we are very capable of looking at how natural variations and the changes of those variations will impact the measurements at particular stations and the emissions at particular stations. And ozone changes and stratospheric changes can have a downward effect on the troposphere, which will also change things, emissions and patterns in the troposphere. So we're I think, fairly well equipped to deal with how that will impact station observations. So thank you for that question. The distinguished delegate of Kenya asked about the map of Africa, and indeed there are a number of ozone observations, ozone profiles made from, for example, Mount Kenya, but ODS observations of CFCs and HFCs, HCFCs are not routinely made in Africa. The station in Rwanda has had some difficulties coming up in operation, and so we don't have observations, ODS, HFC, HCFC observations from Rwanda yet. There were observations of greenhouse gases made at Mount Kenya in the past, but those are, as I understand, no longer being made at Mount Kenya. So the answer is there are ozone observations. We use those quite extensively, and we rely on those particular ozone profiles. We have had some greenhouse gas measurements from Mount Kenya, but ODS observations have not been made very across Africa. It's a very large gap in our understanding of what's going on. The interventions from the distinguished delegate of Canada and Norway, I don't think there were any real questions for me in there, so I will defer unless you have any. No. Okay, so thank you.
Yeah.
Chair, and good morning to everyone. Dr. Newman from the GTF Steering Committee and the Secretariat yesterday for your updates and information provided in response to Decision 3514. We also note there's a lot of information that's been provided by the Secretariat in the various documents provided to this meeting, and it did take a little while to sift through all that information. I'm still not sure that I have it quite right yet. In relation to monitoring locations, as Dr. Newman listed yesterday, there are many factors to take into account, and actually this is not a trivial exercise. Dr. Newman listed some of the physical attributes in his opening slide yesterday, but there are also non-physical requirements needed, such as a determination of the suitability of of the site to capture measurements of controlled substances to be determined through OCs, is that how you say it? And we actually note that actually several sites that measure greenhouse gases and air pollution gases have already been found not to be suitable for measuring ODS. So that is an interesting observation. Also needed is the identification of existing infrastructure, if there is any, and a willingness to engage on the monitoring of controlled substances, and the willingness of the country of the selected site to host a monitoring site and provide setup and long-term support. We appreciate that the Secretariat has begun reaching out to some existing facilities and networks to map existing facilities against identified regional gaps in monitoring of atmospheric concentrations of controlled substances, and we look forward to more information on this mapping exercise becoming available in future. In addition to the location of a monitoring facility, there are other requirements needed, such as the need for a facility to analyse samples, staff training and dedicated personnel, as some of the previous interventions have mentioned. Many requirements in relation to data, calibration, data sharing, peer review, data management, data archiving, all issues that have been highlighted either by the ORM, the documentation, or Dr. Newman. And we would add to this list the need to include top-down inverse modelling to complement any expanded monitoring, one of the issues touched on by the ORM. In relation to the suggestions by the Secretariat for looking at either a step-by-step approach or a programmatic approach to funding, we can see benefits to both, depending on how fast you want to go and how comprehensive you want your program to be. We do see that the step-by-step approach allows for a quicker start-up and a more iterative approach, I think, to both development of monitoring capability and development of funding options. We note that the programmatic approach offers potential economies of scale and greater visibility for donors. We think, however, that perhaps a step-by-step approach would be best to start the work this year, given that there is considerable establishment work to do and considerable iteration to go through. In relation to the source of funds, we see merit in the possibility of using funds internal to the Montreal Protocol. The certainty provided, the control, and potential sustainability are all important issues that probably can be best managed by using internal funds. We appreciate the information provided by the Multilateral Fund Secretariat in Annex 5 of Addendum 1 on how funding from the MLF might be managed on a project basis. However, in this scenario, I think one of the steps we as parties would need to think through a little bit more carefully is how to provide for the scientific advice and independence necessary for the establishment of and running of new monitoring activities. We would not, however, discount the option of seeking funds from external bodies or agencies which have an interest in supporting global environmental outcomes. There might be synergies to explore, which could be usefully explored, with the World Meteorological Organization, perhaps as an implementing partner, or the Jeff Laboratories, as the Secretariat just mentioned earlier this morning. However, we do note the many administrative considerations that would be needed to manage external funds, I think, as some of the other delegations have also noted. On the way forward, Australia is open to the ideas first proposed by the US but taken up by other delegations about taking a staged approach to this issue and focusing on identification and assessment of possible monitoring locations in the first instance. We're also open to the transfer of some funds from the Vienna Convention and Montreal Protocol Trust Funds to commence this work, noting that parties may need to take a number of decisions under both of those, under both of our institutions to facilitate this transfer, and I think that Canada went through some of those issues as well. we consider some sort of demarcation of funding within the General Trust Fund may be required so that funds provided for one purpose are not used for another purpose, and that a steering committee might be needed to oversee funding, establishment of locations, and monitoring of controlled substances, as this type of monitoring is quite different to that of ozone layer monitoring. And we would also like to see the Ozone Secretariat requested to continue its work in mapping possible locations with existing facilities and reaching out to other locations to determine possible interest in coordinated monitoring, possible sharing of monitoring facilities, or being in partnership. Finally, we would like to note our sincere appreciation to the Ozone Research Managers Meeting, the EU UNEP Steering Committee, and the Ozone and Multilateral Fund Secretariats for their work in providing such complex information to us, and we look forward to an interesting and rich discussion this year on this important issue. Thank you.
My delegation would like to join the rest, the other delegation, to thank the government of Canada for this, for hosting us, and also to the Ozone Secretariat for its excellent organization of this event. I know most of my concerns have been raised by other delegates, but I have two more concerns to talk about. We want to first of all thank the brilliant report out scientific report presented by Chip on this observation. I want to, going through the report, I noticed that level of Africa, like what the other colleague of Kenya raised, we have just one station, and it's just now that I discovered the station you're talking about is one located in Rwanda. And we ask the question, what's really the problem that's causing that to have just one station in Africa? Is it because I don't know, we don't have a production of ODS, or we are more consuming countries? That's just one concern we have. I equally want to raise the concern that we have a synergy. I don't know if at all we consume the information by other structures like WNO and IPCC in publishing this report. And I just want, I think this is the second time we're raising this, coming about this question. In the report that we read, we get the IPC in other reports. I don't know at all what's happening with CHIP, that we don't have a large publication or publicity of data collected from most of the stations that can be shared by other institutions that they can use to actually update, like the case of the climate change issue. One issue that was raised here is that we have very few stations, about 10 stations to be that we have in future. I just want to ask, we have two analyses, the flask sample and the high frequency measurement. I want to find out from the presenter, which of the two is more costly? The data collected from the flask, is it more reliable? And if it is more reliable, can we not use this to multiply the center, so that, because if this one is cheaper, we could have more stations in other areas, like the areas that are lacking. In this case, we have more information to talk about. And then the question is what you said, just the question raised by the colleague from Kenya, that Rwanda, there's a problem in that station. I want to know about the problem in that station. Is it the problem of the internet or energy supply, or that they don't have personnel to carry their own station, or road accessibility? Because these are some of the conditions. Is it a priority for you to set the station, or do you need to have a tower as well? Thank you so much. Secretariat.
Auto Russian Federation.
аспекта.
two aspects.
Первое,
The
с точки
first,
зрения
in terms
радикального
of
снижения
the radical
стоимости реализации
decrease in the
проекта,
cost
на наш взгляд,
of this
безусловно,
project being
целесообразно
implemented, we are of the view that
использовать
this would
существующую
be beneficial
инфраструктуру.
to use existing infrastructure.
В частности,
In
и в
particular,
первую очередь,
and first and foremost,
во Всемирной метеорологической организации
that
есть
the
Global Atmospheric
WMO
Watch.
has a global atmospheric
Это
watch.
сеть глобальная,
This is a global
это сеть
network,
станций,
a network of
специально
stations that were
созданных для
specially
изучения
created
химии
to study
атмосферы.
the chemistry
Учитывая то,
of
что
the
мы тоже
atmosphere.
собираемся мерить
And
химические
as
вещества,
we are
на
planning
наш взгляд,
to measure chemical
целесообразно
elements as well,
выбрать
it would be beneficial
станции,
to
которые
choose
нас
those stations
интересуют, и договориться
that
с
we would be
ВМО.
interested in
Я
and
посчитаю,
then
что вы не
negotiate with
хотите
the
таких выражений,
WMO.
чтобы
I
дополнительно там
don't think that
измерялись
there
еще
will
и
be
вплоть бы
any
отбирались пробы
reservations
воздуха.
to additional chemical
Это все
elements
может
being
радикально снизить
measured,
расходы
and this would
по
radically
реализации проекта.
decrease
И
the
второе,
expenditures
у
on
нас
this
есть
project.
вопрос конкретный.
And we have a concrete question as well.
Кто будет определять
Who will
место размещения
define the
станции
locations
и
for
на
the
какой стадии
stations and on
разработки
what
проекта это будет
stage
делаться?
of the project
На наш
will
взгляд,
this be carried out? In
это
our
не
view,
должно происходить
this
без
should not
участия
take place
сторон
without
Монреальского протокола.
the participation
Give the floor to the steering committee members to respond questions.
Let me address the question from the distinguished delegate of Cameroon, asking about specifically the station in Rwanda, which is at Mount Mugogo. And fortunately, one of the co-chairs of the scientific assessment panel, Professor Bonfils Safari of the University of Rwanda is in charge of that station. And it's not IT problem, it's a problem with the instrument itself. It's one of these high-frequency GC instruments, GCMS instruments. And so I will defer to Dr. Safari, who's sitting here in the back, or was sitting here in the back, sorry. He can give you some further details on why the station is not quite operational, and it'll get fairly technical, I think. But thank you for the question. The other more general questions about which is sort of the cost-benefit analysis of flasks versus the high-frequency station. The high-frequency station can make measurements every 2 hours. The instrument is literally located at the station. The flask measurements can be made on any time frequency that you want. You can do it on a monthly basis, you can do it on a weekly, or you can do it a few times per day. Eventually, though, flask measurements require a little more human operation, and so you get to a diminishing return. If you try to do it very frequently, then it's much more costly. The analysis of those flasks is actually done in an analytic laboratory using the same sort of technology, the same technology that is used in these high-frequency measurements, but an analytic facility located somewhere around the world. I mentioned Steve Monska's lab at NOAA in Boulder, Colorado is one of those locations. So which is more costly? Well, you can do the high-frequency measurements are depending on whether you have to build the infrastructure or not. They can be relatively low cost, but you get many more of them. The personnel to operate it probably is a little more costly. The flask measurements can be done if you do it at a fairly low sampling rate, say once per week, can be very inexpensive. You still have to pay for shipping costs in the analytic facilities, the analysis at a particular laboratory. So there's a trade-off there in terms of the frequency of the measurements, but both are quite reliable, but the cost then comes down if you're not doing it very frequently. So thank you for that question. The distinguished delegate of Russia had a question about who defines the locations. And I think from the scientific perspective, we are looking at locations where we think there will be emissions that we can monitor regionally. So we have a scientific perspective, and then of course there's the cost-benefit analysis of that. So those would factor into that. I think one of the more, so a high priority is where are the emissions. Second priority is the host country, whether they're willing to allow a station to be implemented or used, and then with the cost associated with that. And as you pointed out, very correctly, the GAW has developed well, GAW, I guess they didn't pay for the stations themselves, the host countries paid for the stations, but has a lot of existing infrastructures that would be actually, very useful for us to leverage off of. And I think that you see in the cost differential. If we can get a 30-meter tower with a little, you have to get away from the surface when you make these measurements. The winds change as you get closer to the surface. So that's why you have to have something that's 30 meters above the ground. So you would really need a good tower to make these measurements. But if they already exist, you've just saved a huge amount of money. If you've got a little building there that you can house the instruments or do the flasks from, you've saved a huge amount of money. So we definitely want to work with WMO and some of the other international institutions that make these measurements to save money. And the other side of that is, of course, there's possibly scientific expertise there that we can leverage off of also. So thank you for these questions. Sophia, do you want to add anything? Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Once again, I would like to thank the steering committee members. And I do have more parties requesting for the floor, but this came up after I closed the list. So therefore, let me consult with my co-chair on the way forward on this agenda item, and give us a moment. Thank you. 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 Our proposal is to establish a contact group to continue the discussion in detail. And well, today we have the reception as well, so it might not be possible for us to have the first sitting today, but probably tomorrow morning. And the co-chairs of the contact group will be Alessandro from Italy and Liana from Armenia. Thank you. Moving on, I now invite parties to consider agenda item 6 on the presentation of the TEEP 2024 progress report, which will be followed by discussions on the following items, sub-items. A, nominations for critical use exemption for methyl bromide for 2025, energy efficiency and panel membership suggestions, and we also have a sub-item on 6D. But there was no party requesting for the floor when we adopted the agenda on this agenda item on 6D. So now I would like to invite the members of the TEEP to join us on the podium to present to us the key findings from the various parts of the TEEP 2024 progress report. Let me remind parties that the note by the Secretariat, document 46/2, and the addendum to the note, which is document 46/2, add one, and which also includes the summaries of the relevant issues. The full 2024 progress report is available on the meeting portal. The exact references you can also see on the screen. And on behalf of all the parties, I once again thank the chief for their dedication and all the work they do for us. We'll wait the chief members to come to the podium. Can you give the floor to chief members?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the TEEP 2024 Assessment Report on behalf of my co-chairs and the members of the TEEP. Our progress report this year consists of 3 separate volumes. Volume 1 contains the TEEP actual progress report with our sector updates. It also includes separate topics that have been addressed in different agenda items or will be addressed later during this meeting. That would refer to decisions 35.6, 8, and 9. Decision 35.10 on energy efficiency is contained within this presentation. Decision 28.2 paragraph 5 will be addressed later as agenda item 8. Our progress report also contains issues on TEEP procedures and organizational matters and our matrix of expertise. We will also address today the content of Volume 2 on the 2024 CUN Interim Assessment Report, and Volume 3 will be addressed, has been addressed yesterday, sorry. I wish to take a minute to thank my colleagues at the TEEP for their tireless work, and of course give sincere thanks to more than 150 voluntary experts that work on our TOCs and task forces. Thanks very much to all of them. With that, I give the floor to my colleague, Paulo Altoe, who is a co-chair of the FTOC.
He's here. 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 He's here.
A little bit. Thank you. On behalf of my colleague, co-chair Helen Walter Terinoni, I'm going to present the summary of FTOC from the TEEP progress report. Successful transition from hydrofluorocarbons and hydrochlorofluorocarbons continue for most foam types. All previous used HFCs except HFC 152A are no longer allowed for use in foams, and almost all non-A5 parties. Supply chain recovery continues for foam blowing agents and other raw materials. Hydrofluoroolefin, hydrochlorofluoroolefin HCFOs imbalances have eased in both A5 and non-A5 parties due to capacity increases. Higher than expected demand for pentanes has challenged availability in some cases. HFC 365 MFC plant closure in 2023 has created issues for companies in A5 parties that converted to this foam blowing agent. There has been continued use of HFC 245FA blends in A5 parts due to cost of HFO, HCFO alternatives. Many companies have elected to transition away from fluorinated foam blowing agents due to cost of HFCs, HFOs, and HCFOs. Companies in A5 and non-A5 parties have converted to non-fluorocarbons if they can still meet insulation performance and other criteria. Non-fluorocarbon components, for example, hydrocarbons, methyl, methylformate, and methylene chloride are reportedly blended with fluorocarbons to reduce costs. Flammable foam blowing agents and other foam blowing agents with different toxicity create different safe concerns for end users and workers at systems house and foam manufacturers, especially small and medium enterprises. 1,2-dichloromethylene toxicity and use in foams is currently being reviewed by at least one party. Field studies related to spray foam indoor air quality show 1,2-DCE concentrations for months or years after installation. FTOC is seeking additional information about safety measures in use to address exposure and safety risks, especially by small and medium enterprises. Hydrocarbon is being tested as blowing agent for spray foam in some A5 parties. FTOC is currently unaware of broad commercialization. Now I hand over to my colleague co-chair, Aidan Shataway.
Privilege to present an update on the Fire Suppression Technical Options Committee on behalf of my co-chairs, Sergey and Dan. Is it that one?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. We on the Fire Suppression Technical Options Committee are not aware of any new fire suppression alternatives to halons, HCFCs or high GWP HFCs. Not only that, the development of one low GWP blend has ceased, or at least is on pause, and this is possibly owing to the uncertainty in and around the PFAS regulations. The uncertainty of these proposed PFAS definitions and regulations could impact the transitions away from high GWP HFCs, and this could affect some parties' Kigali implementation plans. Research and development activities continue in the civil aviation sector, but as of today, there are no certified alternatives to Halon 1301 for aircraft cargo compartments and engines, and this applies to both newly produced aircraft or retrofit of existing aircraft. And with the European Union end date of 2040 looming quite soon now, this is giving the civil aviation industry some cause for concern. Destruction of Halon 1301 for carbon credits is continuing. This could deplete the global Halon bank of 1301, bringing the run-out date closer to the earlier estimate in our range from 2030 to 2049. Recent fire suppression standards and approvals have been updated to allow the use of reclaimed HFC 227EA for use in new systems as well as for refill. We view this as a very positive step as it begins to incentivise banking of HFC 227EA for fire suppression applications. In the wider fire protection industry, people tell me frequently, halons are banned, they've been phased out. And in the wider fire protection industry, there appears to be this confusion or lack of correct knowledge around the intent of the original Montreal Protocol in relation to halon management. Therefore, parties may wish to consider clarifying and reinforcing the message that recovery, recycling and reclaim or reclamation of fire suppressants is encouraged under the Montreal Protocol. Using halons is not banned, it's just the production and consumption of newly manufactured halons that is for fire suppression that's banned. There's still the issue of transboundary shipments of recovered halons for recycling and reclamation to another party that has these capabilities. And those sort of issues may start to impact the LRM as per the discussions yesterday. Finally, discouraging parties from destroying halons unless they cannot be reclaimed to an acceptable purity. I would like to give a vote of thanks to the European Union for enshrining this in the latest version of their ozone depleting substance regulations. Thank you. Okay. Recently, the Ozone Secretariat have provided data on the production of halons for feedstock applications. We plotted this graphically, and the peaks and troughs seem to align to the measured peaks and troughs for globally measured atmospheric concentrations of halon 1301, so there's something strange going on. We then tried to use the emission factors published by the MCTOC to relate the production for feedstock to emissions, but the scales were just out, they were too low. So as detailed in our progress report, we used successively higher emission factors. We had to get to 26%, but when we did that, the match was remarkable, as shown in the graph on the right. Drawing your attention to that graph, the purple line represents the emissions modelled by the FSTOC. The orange line shows the emissions derived from atmospheric measurements. The black line is the emissions from feedstock production with this 26% emission factor added to the FSTOC model. And I will say it again, the match is remarkable. Actually, it's undeniable. Now then, we know that a 26% emission factor is high, but it's important to recall that there will be additional emissions when the halon 1301 is used as a feedstock, for example, to make the pesticide fipronil. There are patterns describing the yield of fipronil, that is how much of the halon is converted to the fipronil. We don't have all the information, but we do believe that the yield is not inconsistent to give us this overall emission factor. Parties may wish to consider providing information on this topic in the production for and the feedstock use of halon 1301. For example, to the Ozone Secretariat to allow us on the TEEP to continue this assessment. Clearly, more work is needed to understand this fully, but I think we've made a significant step forward over what we didn't understand a couple of years ago. Thank you. I now pass the microphone over to Ian Porter on the clicker.
On behalf of my co-chair, Marta Pisano, MEBTOC and TEEP, I will now give an overview of the critical use nominations for 2024, followed by the progress report. MEBTOC received one application for critical use in 2025 for pre-plant soil use in strawberry nurseries for 2.85 tonnes from Canada.
This represented a 26% reduction from the amount approved last year at the MOP, and Canada reported that no stocks were available at the end of 2023, and the really good part of the CUM was that they indicated a reduction plan to potentially phase out by 2026, so that's in the following year. No A5 parties submitted a CUN for MB use, and in the table below you'll see the interim recommendation that has been made, and MedToc accepted the progress made by Canada, and the interim recommendation was made for the full amount, as you'll see in the table at the bottom right-hand corner in square brackets. This slide shows you the progress of the critical use nomination since 2005, when we received roughly 145 applications, and a pat on the back to all parties here that use methyl bromide. We're now down to one. Over 16,000 tonnes of methyl bromide has been phased out under the critical use process, and this year appears to be the last year for applications for CUEs for methyl bromide, and all of us can hopefully breathe a sigh of relief. We'll now move on to the progress report. The CUM was part of the controlled uses, the last part, the hard part to phase out, but the significant milestone now is that over 99.9% of the 62,000 tonnes of methyl bromide used for controlled uses is now reportedly phased out. Alternatives for QPS MB use, 8 to 10,500 tonnes, is now the focus for all of us. Technically and economically, feasible alternatives are available for about 40% of those QPS uses, and parties are making good progress with alternatives outside of any controls through the Montreal Protocol. Some concern does exist, though, that reports and websites identify that substantial methyl bromide is still being used for unreported controlled use, and we ask those parties to address that. One way to do that is to reinforce policies that ensure that MB is only being used for QPS uses, and that means understanding the definitions of QPS better, and that would help stop diversion from intended use. This means that quarantine MB use is only for a quarantine pest. You need a quarantine pest to treat with methyl bromide under the Q part of the definition. Pre-shipment use is only for officially endorsed, that means by government, control of cosmopolitan pests, and only within 21 days before export. Official documentation also must have been in place before 1996, way back when that definition was put forward. So understanding that may help determine future use, or will help determine your use for QPS. This slide just shows the difference between the controlled uses in blue and the red remaining amounts that are being used for quarantine and pre-shipment. And as we said, there's about 8 to 10,000 tonnes that fluctuates annually for those QPS uses globally. The key messages from the MedToc report are that key alternatives to methyl bromide for QPS uses include ethane dinitrile, hydrogen cyanide, and ethyl formate. Ethane dinitrile has potential to replace up to 50% of MB QPS use for timber and wood products, and that's 50% of the QPS use. Could be done with a product, and it is increasing registration globally. The good news is on impacts of regulations, New Zealand brought in a policy to reduce emissions completely of methyl bromide, and that's led to a sharp drop in QPS use of over 800 tonnes of methyl bromide. and that phosphane's been taken up there for logs, and there may be other alternatives taken up in the future. Australia has accepted controlled atmospheres for capra beetle, which is one of the largest uses and most damaging pests under QPS. Japan is expanding registration of methyl iodide for some QPS uses. However, India has increased QPS consumption due to regulations that actually favour methyl bromide as the primary treatment. MB is required on imported timber and wood products from Uruguay and Argentina within India, and that needs to align with bilateral regulations. The US is unique in using methyl bromide for pre-plant treatments for nursery crops, and there is uncertainty over the future of some of the alternatives. Sulfuryl fluoride, particularly in the EU, where there have concerns been raised that, well, we have concerns and others that some of those treatments may revert back to MB, but hopefully we'll move on to alternatives. With that, I finish the progress report presentation and pass the presentation over to Omar for the rest of the TEEP presentation.
First, I'd like to, on behalf of my co-chairs, Roberto, Fabio, and Rajana, I'd like to present the progress on the RTOC. In RTOC, members met in person in summer 2023 and spring 2024 to determine the structure of the assessment report and reached a consensus that it will be organized around cold chain, comfort cooling and heating applications, and equipment. In terms of membership, we welcomed a fourth co-chair appointed from the US who was already an RTOC member. All members' appointment end in December 2024. Reappointment will be scrutinized to ensure that we can successfully produce the 2026 assessment report and address future challenges while maintaining proper balance. The adoption of lower GWP refrigerants continued to grow in RAC HP. The availability of lower GWP alternative refrigerants continues to grow for all RACHP sectors. 18 new lower GWP refrigerant blends received designations and classifications from ASHRAE Standard 34 and or from ISO Standard 817. Globally, domestic refrigeration industry is accelerating the conversion from HFC 134A to hydrocarbon 600A. In food retail, food service, and transport refrigeration, less than 150 global warming potential alternative refrigerants, including non-fluorinated refrigerants and hydrofluoroolefins containing blends, are common in non-Article 5 parties. In both non-Article 5 parties and Article 5 parties, lower GWP alternative refrigerants continue to replace high GWP R404A and HFC 134A. The HFC HFO blend R452A is now used in road transport refrigeration, while HFO 1234YF is used in marine container refrigeration. In US and Europe, regulatory GWP limits on small and large air conditioning and heat pump systems are driving the growth and adoption of two groups of alternatives, less than 700 and less than 150 GWP alternatives. Vehicle electrification requires holistic vehicle thermal management, heating and cooling of the driver cabin, along with battery cooling. A cooperative research program is underway investigating lower GWP refrigerants suitable for electric vehicles. response to Decision 3510, the RTOC reviewed the energy efficiency landscape and provides the following updates on energy efficiency while phasing down HFCs in their RACHP sectors. Passive cooling, higher energy efficiency standards, and faster phase down of climate warming refrigerants used in the cooling industry could avert up to 60% of the predicted direct and indirect CO2 equivalent emissions from the cooling sector by 2050, according to the Global Cooling Stocktake Report of 2023. Many Article 5 parties are working on approving harmonized regional minimum energy performance standards for ACs and residential refrigerators. Dumping of high GWP and or ODP refrigerant and low energy efficiency cooling equipment is widespread, with additional evidence presented for Southeast Asia. In terms of the energy efficiency implementation progress, the Executive Committee, EXCOM, to the Montreal Protocol Multilateral Fund, MLF, adopted Decision 9165 and created a funded window of $20 million for energy efficiency projects. At their 93rd meeting, the EXCOM approved projects totaling over $4.5 million, including 9 non-investment projects, 2 investment projects, and 4 preparation projects. In addition, since the publication of the report, the EXCOM has approved 4 non-investment projects totaling funding with a total funding of approximately $720,000, including support cost under decisions 94, 54, 55, 56, and 57. Furthermore, we were happy to see that the EXCOM also agreed on a funding window of $100 million for projects developed and implemented under the operational framework elaborated during the meeting, subject to further augmentation by the EXCOM, Decision 9460. With that, I'd like to pass the floor to Helen Tope.
Firstly, on behalf of my co-chairs, Takashi Eriguchi and Jianjun Zhang, and members of the Medical and Chemicals Technical Options Committee, it's my honour to present the progress report from that committee. Firstly, an update on the development of lower GWP propellant MDIs. Pressurised metered dose inhalers, dry powder inhalers, aqueous soft mist inhalers and other delivery systems such as nebulizers all play a role in the treatment of asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. The development of lower GWP metered dose inhalers is progressing, though potential challenges could risk the consistent supply of affordable medicines, as discussed in the 2022 MCTOC assessment report and subsequent progress reports. At least 10 companies globally could have active programs to develop MDIs with lower GWP propellants, HFC 152A and HFO 1234ZEE. Generic MDI manufacturers are also developing lower GWP MDIs, including in Article 5 parties. Development is a complex process involving new ways of manufacturing, new clinical trials, and new regulatory approvals. 3 manufacturers have registered clinical trials for 3 inhalers, which are due to complete in 2025. With subsequent regulatory submissions and approvals, the first lower GWP MDIs may not reach the market until 2026. Now some remarks about MDIs, the HFC phase down and issues for Article 5 parties, and an update on the aerosol sector. The price of bulk HFC propellant currently used in MDIs is likely to increase as HFC quotas for non-pharmaceutical uses tighten, making some MDIs less commercially attractive to manufacture. The price of some new lower GWP MDIs will be higher due to capital investment, research and development, and increased costs of propellants and valves. The impact of global legislation and corporate policies may accelerate the introduction of lower GWP MDIs in Article 5 parties well before their scheduled Kigali HFC phase-down, meaning lower GWP MDIs could be available in Article 5 parties from 2026 onwards. The reduction in HFC's use in Europe and the United States may lead to uncertainty over security of supply and commercial pricing concerns, including in Article 5 parties for current HFC propellants and MDIs. For the non-MDI aerosol market, in that market, it continues to evolve with improvements in aerosol valve technology, allowing for effective use of some non-HFC propellants, such as nitrogen and compressed air, in more applications. Now, on behalf of all of the TEEP and its technical options committees, I'll present several slides on PFAS and emerging policies and sector considerations. Definitions of per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, incorporated into potential future policies varies between jurisdictions. PFAS definitions may include Montreal Protocol controlled substances, their substitutes, and breakdown products, such as trifluoroacetic acid, or TFA, and its salts. The OECD definition of PFAS encompasses a wide range of chemicals, from gases to liquids to solid polymers. It includes TFA and most commercial HFCs and HFOs. It excludes several fluorinated gases such as halons 1301 and 1211, HFC 32, 23, trifluoroiodide, HFC 152A and HCFC 22. Manufacturers and other stakeholders have reported that they are delaying decisions on the selection of alternatives and the associated investments because some or all fluorinated alternatives might become unavailable. This will delay the phase-out of ODS and the phase-down of high GWP HFCs. And now an update on emerging developments in a number of jurisdictions and some sector considerations. Firstly, in Europe, a proposal for the precautionary restriction of around 10,000 PFAS submitted in January 2023 by 5 parties was opened for public consultation by the European Chemicals Agency, ECHA, that would apply to the European Economic Area. ECHA has now completed its public consultation on consideration of restricting many, if not most, fluorinated refrigerants. The proposed ECHA definitions would lead to a restriction on the manufacture, use and placing on the market of many currently used controlled substances and their alternatives. This ECHA definition includes currently used MDI propellants such as HFC 134A and 227EA and one future substitute under development, the HFO. Under the current proposal, these restrictions would apply to MDIs 18 months after entry into force. And now for some other jurisdictions. The US Environmental Protection Agency has continued to implement their risk-based approach delineated in the PFAS Strategic Roadmap EPA's commitments to action 2021 to 2024. A narrower PFAS working definition than the EU REACH proposal is used. The US EPA reporting program excludes certain HFOs, TFA and certain HFCs from the working PFAS definition. Some other jurisdictions, such as China and Japan, so far only restrict certain PFAS that are listed under the Stockholm Convention, such as perfluorooctane sulfonate, perfluorooctanoic acid, and perfluorohexane sulfonate. In 2023, Canada accepted comments during public consultation considering the OECD PFAS definition of approximately 4,700 chemicals. And at the state level, 2 US states have enacted legislation requiring the reporting and banning of PFAS chemicals with a definition broad enough to include substances controlled under the Montreal Protocol. And with that, I'd like to introduce TEEP Co-Chair Ashley Woodcock to present the remaining slides.
And now a few comments from me on the TEEP organisation and work. First of all, on decision 31/8, this requests TEEP to summarise annually how we've been working within the terms of reference through clear and transparent procedures. Some specific points on the terms of reference. We work in full consultation with national focal points regarding proposed nominations using a standardised form and appointment decisions. We've applied new rigour to the annual declaration of interest during 2024. It has to be complete and fully transparent so that co-chairs of TEEP and TOCs can manage any conflict of interest. We now review the terms of reference requirements routinely at the start of all meetings. We update the matrix of needed expertise annually. And the guidance on nominations and appointments is restated in the progress report this time for the benefit of parties. A note on replenishment and how we plan to manage the work. Parties' replenishment of the MLF 2024-2026 triennium was at an historic level, representing a significant milestone in A5 assistance. TEEP, and especially I might commend its replenishment task force, had a very substantial workload to provide the estimated funding that underpinned that funding level, considering for the first time ODS phase out and HFC phase down. TEEP has been reviewing that experience, the lessons learned, and improvements we will make for this standing request, which will include more continuous updating in intervening years, more regular updating of the database and modelling to reflect ExCom decisions, and increasing our engagement with the Multilateral Fund to understand better the future funding direction and decisions that give us insight into their sources of information. TEEP and its TOCs are addressing our changing scope and workload, especially the overlap of the ODS phase-out and the HFC phase-down regimes, and reporting on new topics that flow from the Kigali Amendment, such as HFC alternatives, energy efficiency, and this year
LRM. During 2024, TEEP will have produced 3 major new reports, plus responses to 5 separate decisions requesting updates to information, sometimes only recently provided. The TEEP workload is only manageable because of the steady rhythm that we have of standing decisions with their wide-ranging regular updates. These include regular reports, such as the annual progress report, the quadrennial assessment, the quintennial HFC alternatives assessment, the replenishment report, periodic HAT review. And we also report on new topics, new nominations where there's new information as it becomes available, such as CUNs, EUNs, N-propyl bromide, destruction, laboratory and analytical uses, and process agents, just as some examples. TEEP, of course, also reports on emerging issues, such as CFC11, PFAS, VSLS, vaccine cold chain. This rolling programme can be reviewed at Annex 8 or the TEEP section on the Ozone Secretariat website, where you'll find the new reports that TEEP are expecting to provide through to 2030. 2025 is a busy year with our usual progress report, but especially because the TOCs and TEEP are working hard to develop our assessment reports. We also have a lot of ongoing activities in the background, like replenishment planning, modelling updates, coordinating with our SAP and EEAP colleagues. And in 2026, an even busier year with all those reports being finalised and published, replenishment underway, progress report, and then developing the synthesis report. And on this occasion, we would like to produce an additional TEEP public-facing document, rather like the SAP 20 questions, but relevant to TEEP. TEEP's really a collection of extraordinary individuals working together in a mutually supportive team. On behalf of my co-chairs, Bella in the back here and Marta at the end, I'd like to thank them, we'd like to thank them for their tremendous commitment and contributions, sometimes made in spite of difficult personal times. In the context of team building, TEEP and TOCs need to retain current expertise and to recruit new volunteers. Experts serving on the TEEP and TOCs commit to providing independent expertise, working to consensus, drafting and reviewing products under strict deadlines. TEEP and TOCs have lost some experienced members, especially some non-A5 members, because of lack of travel support for their participation, which is getting more difficult. On the other hand, new members need time to gain experience in the rather unique world of the TOR, TEEP, and the Montreal Protocol. It doesn't happen in a few weeks or months. Meeting face-to-face is an essential part of the TEEP and TOC functioning to maintain the mutual respect and trust that we have that underpins our solid consensus position. Parties may wish to consider funding travel expenses for TEEP and TOC members where needed, irrespective of A5, non-A5 status. TEEP looks to support the work of parties as it works to maintain expertise, evolve its processes, manage its overall workload, and continue to deliver its work. And a last slide, if I may, on some details, if I may, thank you, Helen, on details of membership and organisation for this year particularly. At the end of 2024, terms of appointment will end for 1 TEEP co-chair, 3 TOC co-chairs, and all of our senior experts. These are detailed in Annex 5. of the TEEP 2024 progress report. I want to emphasize the valuable role that senior experts fulfill in providing specific expertise not covered by TEEP or TOC co-chairs. Current senior experts have world-leading expertise and experience in economics, in modeling, in Montreal Protocol processes and experience, and working with implementing agencies. They bring a new dimension to us which is enormously helpful. TEEP looks to the continuing support of parties to identify experts through its matrix of media expertise, and when doing so, to ensure that those experts can fully participate in the activities and work of the TEEP and its TOC for parties. TEEP requests that parties considering nominations do have informal discussions with TEEP and TOC co-chairs as appropriate, and in bold, prior, please, to making a formal nomination. That would be super helpful. Lastly, TEEP is working to consider its response to Decision 35/20, options for the organisation of TEEP and its TOCs, which will be due for next year's open-ended working group. And with that, I thank my colleagues and thank you for your attention.
Is presentation done now? Is the presentation done? Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for the presentation and for your excellent report. Just like yesterday, we plan to have the clarification questions first, and then we go separately by sub-item, by each item separately. But you could also see that it's going to be lunch break soon, so we would urge parties to try to finish the clarification questions at least before the lunch break, and then maybe after the lunch break we start with the sub-items. So now I open the floor for the clarification questions only. And if delegates have specific issues to raise on the three sub-items, then you may wish to do so when we open the sub-items. The floor is open for the clarification questions. Kuwait, you have the floor.
TEEP for their hard effort, and I will also echo my appreciation and thanks for the team with the appreciation of TEEP for itself also. So we are joining together to appreciate all of us. So I think that the reports conclude and have a lot of interesting issues, but as this is a general questions and clarification, in page 7, we start looking to using a term or language that it's never been used, like we are saying in paragraph 1.1.5, good technology options. This is a new thing. What is the meaning of good technology options? Do we have bad technology option, good technology option, well accepted? Because this is a new for me. From previous report I read, I never listened to something called good technology options. Either this is a technology option proven or this is something that in mind. The other word is using that we are using alternative are known. And the second paragraph are well known. So what is the good and what is the known and what is the well known? So this is categorization coming from where? Scientifically, as a use, as access to it, so we didn't understand the language in these pages. So I think that we need more clarification, because what we are saying that technology have to be technically proven, commercially available. So this is the language that we understand, but good option technology is accessible or not, we didn't see it. We want to understand more on this one. And I also see in the report that the team always indicating and giving us a very static, foggy place when he talk about BFAS. In every paragraph he put BFAS regulation, BFAS regulation. What is the message that TIAB want to send for Article 5 parties? That don't move, be careful, be cautious, wait for 5-6 years about this regulation, and we don't understand all this regulation influence. The other element about the energy efficiency, when you mentioned the energy efficiency, you mentioned the EXCOM approved project, but you didn't categorize it, because we know it, we read it, we see it in the report of the EXCOM. What is the added value of mentioning this project? Because you didn't mention what is the outcome, influence of this project if it's completed, and how that will affect the choice of technology and energy efficiency intervention of Article 5 parties. The second element, that when you mention the increase in your paragraph, increase of limitation of charge from 700 or 150 to 1.5, you didn't mention the effect of this limitation on the cost and also on the maintenance of these, because this is the safety element especially for this one. The last comment from me for clarification, you mentioned there's a regulation in EU and US that they will start using 700 GWP for that, but you didn't mention this is for domestic use or for exporting uses, because this is very important, because EU regulation consists of domestics and a leverage for 5 or 10 years to export high GWP alternative for Article 5 countries. So we want a lot of clarification about this one, and I will stop here. Thank you very much for this.
Now I would like to give the floor to Bahrain.
The co-chairperson, and I would like to thank the TIAB team for this update and for this great effort that was deployed in putting together this presentation, updating, providing us important information. Even I would also like to clarify in first instances. The first one, blowing agent or blowing agent, and مقارنة الآر 141B المستخدم R141B that is used السبراي فورم هناك زيادة بالagent in some spray forms so from 27 to البدائل المتنوعة 6% increased compared to the current alternatives. بعض المنتجات خصوصا specific details بعض البدائل كالHFC والalternatives HFC قد تكون غير مناسبة الكثير من البلدان ولكن لم يتم تحديد الخيار المناسب suitable appropriate alternative was not determined. على سبيل الافتراض for instance أحد المنتجات مثال الفورمات وأود أن أستفسر عن هذا المنتج تحديدا مثلا عن مدى رجعة هذا المنتج بديل مستقبلي خصوصا مع عمليات التخلص التي تمر فيها بلداننا وخصوصا في بلدان ذات درجات الحرارة المرتفعة الأمبيانت فلم أرى تفصيل لذكر هذا المنتج مثل الفورمات بشكل يعني يعطي انطباعا لدى البلدان التي تنتقل باستخدام خيارات أخرى نذكر بعض الخيارات غير مناسبة وبالتالي هل هذا الخيار على سبيل الافتراض كمادة كيميائية قد تكون مناسبة على المدى الطويل. الجانب الثاني الذي أتطرق إليه فيما يخص قطاع التكييف كم ذكر أيضا على سبيل المثال أن الR32 يوجد اعتماد سريع له في
وتم ذكر بعض التفاصيل على سبيل الافتراض استخدامه في المانيبيوليت والباكجز ولكن مع ذكر ايضا ملاحظة على مستوى السعة الاصغر فلم افهم ما هي السعة الاصغر المقصود فيها وهل هذا معناه ان الاعتماد السريع الذي اشار له التقرير هو ايضا يتحدث عن ساعات اصغر على مستوى محدد ام انه فقط ساعات اصغر بدون ان يتم تحديد هذه الساعة هل 6 طن على سبيل الافتراض تشميلي هي ساعة صغيرة او كبيرة هل الساعة الصغيرة تميل الى 3 طن فقط او لا لما نتكلم عن باكج او دكتسبيلت الى اي مستوى لم يحدد التقرير هذا الامر وبالتالي ارى ان هناك تضارب بين التعبير اعتمادات سريعة للأوتكمز في قطاع التكييف وفي بلدان يتحدث حتى عن الشرق الاوسط ولم يذكر ايضا ان هل هذا الاعتمادات السريعة هي في بلدان ذات درجات حرارة مرتفعة كبلداننا مثلا ام انه يتكلم عن درجات حرارة اقل. النقطة الثالثة في الجزء المتعلق بالماك قطاع المواصلات والسيارات على سبيل الافتراض ذكر احد الخيارات المهمة عن 134A هو ال HFO12341F وطبعا هذا الخيار وجدناه في السنوات الأخيرة في بعض السيارات الفارهة على سبيل الافتراض ولكن لم نرى انتقال سريع له في بلداننا على التقدير في السيارات التجارية والاقتصادية ولكن يشير التقرير ان هذا احد الخيارات البديلة المتاحة للمصنعين على المستوى المستقبلي وبالتالي استفساري هو هل ان هذا البديل سيكون له هل هناك تقييم اولا للاسعار تاثير الاسعار عند الانتقال بهذا النوع من الوسائط مقارنة بالآر 34A وهل هناك تأثير واضح أو غير واضح لحد الآن لم يذكره التقرير وأيضا ما مدى فعالية هذا الوسيط على مستوى درجات أو بلدان درجات حرارة المنطقة العالية وشكرا مرة ثانية إلى اللجنة وعلى ما قدموا في هذا التقرير شكرا لكم
list and the first set of after the first set of questions I will be closing the list. So now I have Tunisia, Nigeria, Zambia, EU, Saudi Arabia, Argentina, India, EU again, United States, Brazil, Canada and Egypt. And for the first round of after the first round of questions, I will be closing the list. So now I give the floor to Tunisia.
Secretariat for this organization and the government of Canada for the warm welcoming. I would like to thank the team for this valuable presentation and important information mentioned in this report. My question specifically is to the ARTOC team. What are the technical means and methods that need to be adopted in order to improve energy efficiency when implementing the air-conditioning products and also the home refrigeration products when it comes to the low GWP alternatives, taking into account the production lines transition usually focus on the change of the cost and the leak detection equipment and the safety equipment, and these devices and equipment are not relating to the improvement of the energy efficiency, 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 efficiency.
The tip for this excellent presentation and informative. 10 of the TIAP report, mainly to FS talk, the use of halons. Parties are discouraged from destroying halons unless they cannot be reclaimed to an acceptable purity. I think this statement is mainly for halon 1301. I would like clarification. What do we do with the decommission halon 1211, 2402? Regarding the reuse and storage of this halon for onward transfer to the critical use, I find out that due to the bottlenecks in transborder movement of these gases, we have some halons of which, because of this bottleneck of DOT and a lot of issues around transborder movement of this waste, what do we do with these halons that we have? The decommissioned halon that we have. I want clarification on that. Mainly, can 1211 be reused or and 2402? What do you do with them? We only have information on 1301. I want information on 1211 and 2402. Thank you.
To respond to these questions, and if there are any party who would like to take the floor, this is the time before TIP finishes answering the questions. Thank you. TIP, you have the floor.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's related to the question from this distinct delegate from Bahrain, related to foam blowing agents, specifically for, let's say, hot countries, and the usage of methyl in foams in high ambient temperature. 141B is, let's say, an easy blowing agent to work with, even though in high ambient temperature some specific conditions must be taken, especially if you use the material in remote areas. For example, if you are in a field to spray the foam, even 141B sometimes blow from the mixture. When you go for HFOs, we have to combine HFOs with higher amount of water and, if possible, using additional methylformate to keep good cost of formulations. Like this, the boiling point of the material will be similar to 141B, and performance of foam also will be similar. If you want to discuss this into more details, we can have a side conversation or face-to-face conversation. Thank you.
Delegate from Nigeria, for your question. Whilst you are sort of right that the Halon 1301 is the halon that is in the shortest supply and the most critical and absolutely should not be destroyed unless it is contaminated, Halons 1211 and 2402 are still needed, and we would advocate that they should not be destroyed either. The second part of the question, I think, related to the difficulties, perceived or real, regarding transboundary shipments. The answer to sort of both those questions can be found in that there are numerous global halon and other fluorocarbon recycling companies that will facilitate the collection and shipment of these materials so that they can be found new users. I think that's pretty much answered your question, hopefully. If you need any further details, again, we can have a bilateral or a conversation in the margins. Thank you. 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 Thank you.
Regarding the question about good technology options, here good refers to available and accessible. We did not mention that explicitly, but that was our intention. In terms of our description about PFAS, we are following this very closely in RTOC, and we, as we described it in our summary and in our progress report, there is the industry is on guard, and we relay what is happening in the industry. When we mentioned the energy efficiency in our slide, we are not aware of what has happened for projects yet, because these are all new projects. However, what we focused about was the funding level. So the current funding was 4.5, and with the newly approved ones, another 700, so maybe $5.2 million out of the total funding window of $20 million. This shows that there is a big potential. We know that this is, the funding window is up to the 96th meeting, so we would like to see more projects coming in. Regarding the refrigerant charge and safety standards, again, this is a progress report, and RTOC experts wanted to highlight the issue. We did not have a decision asking us what is the cost, and the decision was for the progress, and we highlighted the progress, that there is a progress in terms of the charge that is happening, and we highlighted that with this comes challenges, and we highlighted those challenges. For the distinguished member from Bahrain, in terms of the low limit for air conditioners, the low limit for air conditioners is yet to be explicitly defined. We don't have consensus on it at RTOC, but I hate to give the number right now. So, but typically it is the lower range of window air conditioners and mini-split units. For MAC options, yes, we mentioned hydrofluoroolefin 1234YF as an alternative to 134A. While it is now being the standard in luxury cars, we believe that it would be the mainstream refrigerant for MAC application, since it is a direct replacement for 134A, and there is no it does not sacrifice performance even at high ambient conditions. For the distinguished member delegate from Tunisia, while improving energy efficiency, the TEEP has produced several task force and working group reports that detailed what needs to be done to to improve energy efficiency while converting AC and refrigeration. But in summary, we need to focus on the equipment itself and the design of the equipment, the components that are used in the equipment design, and that's why it was not discussed in the progress report. Thank you.
What my colleague Omar said in relation to PFAS, and to respond on behalf of the TEEP, where Kuwait asked about, why we're reporting on PFAS regulations, what is the impact, what are we saying to the parties. I'd just like to start by saying that the TEEP has reported, where possible and where available, the regulations on PFAS that are under development in countries and in regions, because of their potential impact on the use of controlled substances and the use of their alternatives. And we do this for parties in response to a number of standing decisions that ask us to update the parties in our progress report on any available information on the use of and alternatives to controlled substances. At the present, we cannot be definitive as to the outcome of some of those regulatory or policy developments and final controls that might be adopted in the future, because some of those processes are still underway and it could be some years before they're concluded. What we do know is that we've had reports from industry that they are delaying decisions in terms of investment and in selection around alternatives because they are concerned that some of the fluorinated alternatives might become unavailable. And what we said in our slide was, as a summary of that, was that it's likely that this could delay the phase-out of ODS, or it will delay the phase-out of ODS and phase-down, because industry is pressing the pause button on some of these alternatives. So I think that obviously we will continue to report on developments as they proceed, but the priority is that we will report on how it might impact on the phase out of ODS and high GWP products as those processes continue, and we'll continue to provide available information on all potential alternatives with details about their technical, environmental impacts and their availability. Thank you.
Time, so we will continue this agenda item after lunch, and before I close, I would like to close the list as well, and I would read the list. As of now, it's EU, Saudi Arabia, Argentina, India, and I see EU again, and I believe it's a mistake, United States, Brazil, Canada, Egypt, Zambia, and Trinidad and Tobago. With this, we close the list, and I would also see if Secretariat has an announcement to make. Yes. The contact group on VSLS from 1:45 to 2:45 at CR3. Have a good lunch. See you at 3 sharp. Thank you.